Hello everyone. Today, we travel back to a time where marriage wasn't something you searched for, longed for, or fell into. It was something arranged, assigned, sometimes even signed in ink before your hands could write your name. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. So dim the lights, let the breath soften in your chest, and let yourself fall slowly into a life that never asked what your heart wanted. Because tonight, you were born in the Middle Ages, and the first thing you learn is that love doesn't get a vote. You were born near a stream, or maybe at the edge of a manor field. Your parents whispered prayers as you entered the world, but before you could walk, they were already thinking ahead about your future union. Not who you would love, but who you would be useful to. Marriage wasn't romantic, it was logistical. A village didn't survive on dreams, but on cows, harvests, and alliances. By the age of 7, if your family had anything to trade, a goat, a corner of the mill, a promise of bread come winter, your name might already be linked to someone else's. You might not even remember the first time you met your future spouse. It could have been at a feast, a christening, a market. You were playing with straw dolls. They were kicking dust near the oxen. And someone older smiled and said, "One day you'll marry." They weren't joking. The church taught that marriage was sacred, a bond before God. But in practice, it was often a tool. If you were nobility, marriage created peace between rival houses. If you were a peasant, it meant having more hands to gather wheat or herd sheep. The emotions of the betrothed weren't consulted. Emotions didn't till soil or produce heirs. For girls, marriage came early, usually as soon as they could bear children. 12, 13, maybe younger. For boys, it depended on strength. Could you lift a scythe, carry a pig, defend a fence line? Then you could marry. The wedding day itself was often a strange mix of festivity and finality. There might be bread and ale, maybe a fiddle or two, but the real event wasn't the celebration. It was the transition. You stepped across an invisible line. You weren't a child anymore. You belonged to someone, and to a new set of expectations. Your clothes might change. If you were a girl, your hair could be braided differently, your apron tied with a new ribbon to signal your married status. If you were a boy, you might be expected to wear a belt of your own, a sign that you now had responsibilities and debts. You might not know the person beside you very well. You might not like the way they laughed, or how they chewed, or the smell of their clothes. But they were yours now. Or more precisely, you were each other's. And that meant something binding, whether affection followed or not. In some villages, a priest would say a few words. In others, the couple would simply clasp hands in front of witnesses and vow their intent. The legality was less important than the visibility. The whole community had to know. Everyone had to see. Because marriage wasn't just between two people. It was a contract with the entire village. And what about love? It's not that love didn't exist. It did. Quietly, sometimes painfully. But it wasn't the reason people married. In fact, too much affection could be suspicious. Desire was considered dangerous. Passion was something that led to sin. The church often warned against carnal temptation, even within marriage. A couple was allowed to be intimate, yes, but only in certain ways, at certain times, and only with the purpose of creating life. So if you developed feelings for your spouse, that was tolerated. But if you let those feelings distract you from duty, from prayer, from societal order, it became problematic. Still, some couples found each other in the dark, not in grand declarations, but in the little things. Maybe he noticed you always left the bread crusts for the children. Maybe she remembered to warm your shoes near the hearth on cold mornings. Maybe, one night, when the rain wouldn't stop and the baby wouldn't sleep, your fingers touched under the covers and didn't pull away. Maybe over time, you found a rhythm, a slow dance of routine and necessity that softened into something like tenderness. But that wasn't guaranteed. And it wasn't the goal. Survival was. There were no dating periods, no long conversations to get to know one another. Emotional intimacy, if it grew, did so after marriage, not before. And if it didn't, you coped. There was no divorce, only annulment, and only under very strict and rare conditions, usually if the marriage hadn't been consummated, or if a close blood relation had been discovered. So if you were unhappy, or if your spouse was cruel, or if life with them felt like a prison you had to endure, or find comfort elsewhere, in friendship, in faith, in small acts of resistance, some did rebel. There were stories of women who refused arranged matches, who fled convents to escape forced marriages, men who chose celibacy over obligation, but those were rare and dangerous. Most people didn't dream of changing their fate. They dreamed of making peace with it. Now, imagine lying in bed beside someone you barely know. The straw mattress creaks beneath you. There are no candles, too expensive, only the dim light of the hearth fading. You hear the wind through the gaps in the wall. You smell the smoke from the day's fire, the sweat of two tired bodies, the sour tang of cheese from the corner shelf. You pull the blanket, wool, coarse, scratchy, a little higher. Your fingers brush theirs. They're calloused, real, present. You both breathe, slow and steady. Tomorrow, you'll fetch water together, or mend nets, or walk to the village square in silence. This is not a love story. Not yet. But it's the beginning of something. And sometimes, beginnings are quiet. Just like this one, you were married now, not in the way modern vows echo in chapels, whispered promises under stained glass. No, your wedding ended with bread, ale, and the soft crunch of hay underfoot. Maybe someone played a lyre, maybe the village drunk sang too loudly, but now the songs were over, and the whole village was waiting. You see, in medieval Europe, the consummation of a marriage wasn't just a private event. It was proof. A contract needed evidence. And that evidence was your body. Tonight, you and your new spouse would lie together, under a strange sheet, one with a hole in the middle. Yes, really. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and what time is it? It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Pull the blankets up. Imagine rough linen. Imagine footsteps outside the door. Tonight, the most intimate part of your life is a public concern. Some cultures use the chambre nuptiale, the bridal bed ceremony. In this tradition, family members, neighbors, or even officials would escort the couple to their bedroom. Sometimes they lit candles, said prayers, or sprinkled herbs for fertility. In some regions, they even stayed in the room, just behind a curtain, waiting for sounds or silence, or anything that signaled the deed had been done. In parts of France, a nobleman's marriage wasn't legally recognized until blood appeared on the sheets. These sheets were sometimes examined, displayed, or paraded the next morning as proof of virginity and of rightful consummation. Imagine that. Imagine knowing your first night of intimacy wasn't private, but required a mark, a stain, a sign that your body had fulfilled its role. In England, some courts even kept the right to annul a marriage if the couple hadn't performed their marital duty. And that meant people asked questions, watched, waited. In many cases, the pressure wasn't just spiritual, it was economic. A dowry was paid, lands transferred, titles merged. If the marriage wasn't consummated, all of that could be undone. So your body wasn't yours. It was evidence. It was collateral. Now imagine this. You and your new spouse stand awkwardly beside the bed. You can hear laughter outside. Someone's still drinking. A friend of your father's. You're both young, maybe unsure, maybe scared. Your spouse's hand reaches for yours. Is it kind? Is it trembling? You lie down. The room smells of candle wax and iron from the latch on the door. The walls are stone, and they breathe cold into the air. You try to be still. You try to be brave. You try to remember what your older cousin whispered to you weeks ago. It didn't make much sense then. It still doesn't now. If you're lucky, your spouse is gentle. If you're lucky, they're just as confused as you are. If you're lucky, this won't hurt too much. Because for many women, the first night of marriage came with pain. Physical, yes, but also emotional. The shame, the fear, the weight of being watched. Even if no one's in the room, they're still waiting just beyond the door, listening, judging. And for men, the pressure to perform could be just as overwhelming. If things didn't happen, if nerves got the better of you, it could lead to mockery, suspicion, even annulment. It was a night of immense pressure masquerading as tradition. In some noble courts, physicians were even called to examine the couple the next morning if doubts arose. They'd ask questions, check bruises, smell linens, write reports. What began as a spiritual bond had become a forensic procedure. And yet, not every couple followed this script. In some places, the pressure was lighter. A couple could simply retreat to their home and be left alone, especially among poorer communities where no one had time for formalities. Still, the idea lingered. A marriage wasn't real until bodies touched, and those touches weren't yours to keep. They were owed to the family, the village, the church. But, sometimes, behind the curtain of obligation, something else emerged. Maybe you and your partner laughed, quietly, when no one could hear. Maybe you both admitted how nervous you were. Maybe you held hands until sleep came. No blood, no ceremony, no proof. Just warmth. Just two people, lying beside each other for the first time. The sounds of the world fading beyond the shutter. And in the morning, no one asked questions. Or if they did, you just smiled and nodded. And that was enough. You pull the blanket tighter. Let yourself disappear into the hush of the chamber. The fire has gone out. The last echo of footsteps has faded. Outside, the world is still. Inside, a beginning takes shape. Messy, awkward, tender, unspoken. You are not a spectacle. Not anymore. Just two souls, breathing softly in the dark. You're married. The village has stopped watching, or so it seems. The sheets have been washed, or burned, depending on what they revealed. The ale jugs are empty. The music has gone quiet. And now comes the real strangeness. Because sleeping together, that's not what you imagined. There's no canopy of silk, no feathers, no candles flickering beside a cozy hearth. There isn't even a room of your own. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Take a breath and settle deeper into your own blanket. Because tonight, you're going to discover what it truly meant to share a bed and a life in the Middle Ages. Beds in the medieval world weren't private. They weren't romantic sanctuaries, nor were they necessarily comfortable. For most, a bed was straw stuffed into a coarse sack. A lumpy, itchy mattress laid directly on the floor, or if you were lucky, on wooden planks slightly elevated to avoid rats. You didn't share it just with your spouse. You might share it with children, with siblings, sometimes even with servants or guests. In cold climates, bodies were warmth, and warmth was survival. Privacy? That was a luxury. Intimacy happened between whispered words and the shifting of bodies in the dark. In many peasant homes, the bed sat in the same room where meals were cooked, bread was kneaded, and animals were brought in during storms. Imagine sleeping while your in-laws snored nearby, the goat shifted in its corner, and the fire crackled with damp wood. If you were nobility, your bed might be grander, raised, with carved posts and heavy curtains. But even then, you rarely slept alone. Servants slept on pallets nearby, wet nurses, pages, watchmen. There were always ears, always footsteps. So when did couples find time to be alone? Sometimes they didn't. For many, the idea of sleeping together didn't mean cuddling under a shared blanket. It meant existing side by side in the rhythms of survival. You laid down exhausted. You rose with the first bell of the church or the rooster's crow. You worked in silence, ate in silence, slept in silence. And yet, within that silence, something lived. A routine, a ritual, a sense of presence. Maybe your spouse tucked the blanket under your shoulder when the wind howled. Maybe you found your legs tangled by dawn and didn't pull away. Maybe they murmured your name in their sleep. These were the moments when affection bloomed, quietly, almost secretly, like moss between stones. And what of the bed itself? If you were among the very poor, there might not be a bed at all, just straw on packed dirt, changed when the fleas became unbearable. You'd lie wrapped in cloaks or old linen, your spouse breathing beside you, your backs curved against the cold. The smell of the day clung to everything, sweat, firewood, damp wool, and still, you slept, because sleep was essential. Work waited with the dawn. Middle-class homes might afford a wooden bed frame, maybe even a linen sheet, and a single wool blanket, but it was heavy, scratchy, and never quite enough. In noble houses, couples had separate chambers more often than not for lack of affection, but because sleep was too precious to risk to another's tossing. Visiting each other's beds was often scheduled, or at least planned. A knock on the chamber door, a whispered greeting, a candle blown out quickly. So in truth, the idea of sleeping together was inconsistent. In some homes, it was nightly necessity. In others, rare occurrence. The only certainty was that the act of sharing a bed wasn't always about love, but about life. You close your eyes. Imagine the feel of coarse fabric under your cheek, the faint scent of ash, a shoulder shifting beside you, maybe a hand searching for yours. Outside, the wind presses against the wooden walls. The animals stir. You don't say anything, neither do they, but you're here, together, under one blanket. And in the quiet, that might be enough. By now, you've learned that love in the Middle Ages wasn't about grand gestures or candlelit glances. It was about cohabiting, surviving, in a shared rhythm. But even without words, or privacy, or choice, something still spoke. Not through poetry, not through roses, but through smells, through textures, through silences held between two tired people in a cold room. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, adjust your pillow. Imagine the rustle of rough linen, the faint musk of earth and skin, the soft flicker of firelight playing on wooden beams. Tonight, we listen to the love language of a world with no perfumes, only presence. Let's start with smell. In a time before soap was common, before bathing was routine, bodies carried the scent of the day. A man smelled of oxen, sweat, and barley dust. A woman carried the fragrance of onions, wool grease, and warm bread. And strangely, these weren't unpleasant. They were familiar, recognizable, a kind of signature. After a long day, you didn't lean into each other expecting lavender or rose. You leaned in because that smell meant home. It meant here you are, still breathing, still alive. Hygiene varied by region, wealth, and season. A few lucky villages had access to bathhouses, communal, busy, loud. Others bathed rarely, sponging limbs with vinegar or infusions of herbs. But even then, full immersion was rare. So your spouse's body spoke in scent, and you learned to understand it, to find comfort in it, maybe even desire, as odd as that seems to modern sensibilities. Then came texture, the physical world of touch. Clothing wasn't soft, underwear was rare. Most garments were wool, linen, or leather, thick, heavy, practical. They scratched, they chafed. They didn't invite caresses. So when your partner reached out, bare fingers brushing a wrist, a thumb resting on your spine, it meant something. A touch through layers was easy. A touch through skin, that was intimacy. Imagine lying down after a day of threshing wheat. Your muscles ache, your hands are raw. Your spouse sits beside you, untying their shoes. You notice their ankles, pale against the firelight. You hand them a bowl of broth. Their fingers graze yours. No words. But the way their hand lingers, that is a conversation. And then, the silence. Not the silence of tension, but the silence of exhaustion, of mutual respect, of nothing left to prove. In the medieval home, especially in peasant life, evenings were quiet. Voices were hushed. You didn't fill the space with chatter. You didn't ask, "How was your day?" You knew. You were there. So couples communicated in glances, in the way one set the bowl down closer to the other, in the way a cloak was draped, in the way 2 feet touched under a table, unnoticed by others. The medieval world didn't give couples many tools for verbal intimacy. Literacy was rare. Emotional language was scarce. So people found other ways to speak. Some carved initials into wood beams. Some left small gifts in shoes. Some simply stood beside each other when the wind picked up. Wordless, motionless, together. And sometimes there was music. Not always instruments, but humming. A lullaby. A chant from childhood, shared in a moment of tenderness. Maybe you hummed as you stirred the pot, and they echoed the tune while sharpening tools. It was a kind of echoing, not quite love songs, but sounds that wrapped around both of you. Even arguments were quiet. Passive resistance, silence that stretched. A bowl placed a little harder on the table, a gaze held too long, or not at all. And then, a forgiveness without apology. Just bread passed first, or a shoulder touched before sleep. These were not grand romances, but they were full lives. You learned each other's rhythms like you learned the changing seasons, gradually, with patience. You adjusted, you adapted, you endured, and sometimes, beneath it all, you even cherished. Now return to your place by the fire. The room is dim. The day has ended. You fold your spouse's tunic quietly. You place it by the bed. You blow out the candle, but not before glancing once, briefly, into their eyes. Nothing is said. But in that glance lives the memory of shared toil, of bread divided, of footsteps side by side. And in that stillness, something ancient stirs. You don't need language. You've lived the story. You didn't marry for love. You didn't sleep in private. You didn't speak your feelings aloud, not often. And now, as you begin to understand desire, you realize it's not yours either. Because in the Middle Ages, your body, your longings, your silences, your touch belonged, first and foremost, to God, or at least to those who claim to speak for him. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now breathe deeply. Let your eyes grow heavy. Because tonight we lie in bed, with the church watching. The medieval church didn't merely offer spiritual guidance. It shaped the rhythms of everyday life, especially in the realm of the body. Sex was seen as sacred, but dangerous, a paradox. On one hand, it was the act that created life, and life was God's greatest gift. On the other, it was rooted in flesh, and flesh was suspect, weak, temptable, sinful. So the church tried to control it, to sanctify it through rules. Manuals were written, sermons preached, confession booths built. What emerged was a system of acceptable desire, a narrow corridor within which married couples could safely move. Outside that corridor, punishment, shame, penance. Even within marriage, sex had strict guidelines. It must be with your spouse. It must be done in moderation. It must not be done on holy days, and there were many. It must be for the purpose of procreation. It must not involve unnatural acts, a term as vague as it was fearful. Desire without intent to conceive was discouraged, pleasure without purpose was condemned, and even mutual enjoyment could be framed as spiritual weakness. Imagine this. You're lying beside your partner. A quiet night, the embers are low, there's warmth between your bodies, breath mingling in the dark. And suddenly, in your mind, the voice of the local priest. Lust is a fire that consumes the soul. You shift uncomfortably. Is this act holy? Is it allowed tonight? Is it sinful to want? You think of saints who slept on stone floors, of monks who flogged themselves to silence temptation. You wonder if your thoughts are clean enough. Your spouse touches your arm. You freeze, then exhale. You're married. It's permitted, right? Still, guilt lingers like smoke. The penitentials, church books listing sins and their punishments, were shockingly detailed. For every deviation from the norm, there was a price. If you kissed too long, penance. If you thought lustfully, penance. If you touched your spouse on a Sunday, penance. If you used your imagination, penance. Desire became something to confess, to fear. And yet, it persisted. Despite the rules, humans remained human. Couples found ways to navigate the spiritual minefield. They whispered instead of shouted. They closed shutters tight. They claimed fevers when they felt flush with need. In some cases, clergy were more understanding. Parish priests, especially in rural areas, often looked the other way, or quietly encouraged moderation rather than repression. After all, a marriage without intimacy was a marriage at risk. Some priests even offered guidance. In confession, a wife might reveal her husband's cruelty, his demands. A man might admit to struggling with temptation. The best confessors didn't judge, they guided. But others wielded shame like a weapon. And in those parishes, desire died in silence. Still, longing has its own language. You might hold your spouse's hand a little longer, brush their hair with careful fingers, watch them as they kneel to pray, and feel something stir. You don't act, but you feel, and that too becomes a kind of closeness. And when the time comes, when you do reach for each other, it's quiet, sacred even, a kind of ritual in itself. No one else needs to know. Only the dark, and the breath you hold between prayers. So tonight, as you pull the blanket close and close your eyes, know this. Even under the weight of doctrine, even with saints staring down from painted wood, love still found ways to breathe, quietly, carefully, and sometimes beautifully. You're a few years into your marriage now. The harvests have come and gone. Maybe you've lost a child. Maybe you've buried a parent. You know the rhythm of your spouse's steps. The way they cough in the morning, the sigh they make before sleep. But something stirs in your chest, a question. One you never dared ask when the vows were said, or when the first night passed beneath watchful eyes. But now, when the days grow quiet, it whispers. Is it possible to love someone you never chose? Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and what time is it? It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Let your body relax. Sink into the question. Because tonight we ask, was love a privilege or simply a rare accident? In medieval society, love was rarely the foundation of marriage. It was more often its byproduct, if it arrived at all. Marriage was a duty, a means of securing peace, property, or produce. A girl married to bear heirs. A boy married to gain labour and lineage. No one asked if you were happy. They asked if your fields were full. And yet, stories persisted. In poetry, in songs, in whispers at the market. Stories of love, not arranged, but awakened. a baker who waited each day to see the miller's daughter pass, a widow who refused remarriage, not from grief, but from devotion to a love lost in war, a knight who carried a token, a thread, a lock of hair, not from his wife, but from someone he could never name. These were not the norm, but they existed, and because they existed, they gave people hope. In noble circles, marriage was pure strategy. Daughters were married off before they bled. Sons were matched with dowries that would fatten estates. But nobles weren't immune to longing. They wrote letters, confided in troubadours, built chapels in secret. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her time, married for politics, and then later for passion. Abelard and Heloise, a love so scandalous it ended in cloisters and tragedy. Even kings, bound to queens by treaty, kept mistresses whom they loved far more fiercely. So what did that mean for common folk? Love was a luxury, a risk, a rebellion. To marry for affection was rare. To find it within marriage, rarer still. But when it happened, it shaped lives in quiet ways. You might notice your spouse laughing in a way they didn't when you met. You might find yourself seeking their eyes in a crowd. You might reach for their hand, not from duty, but from want. And suddenly, something changes. Bread tastes warmer. The walk to the well feels shorter. The fire at night flickers a little softer. You begin to look forward to small things. Their voice at dusk, their touch after prayer, the way they sit when lost in thought. It's not passion as the poets describe. It's not courtly love, but it's real. It's yours. And yet, love didn't erase hardship. You still argued about livestock, about siblings, about silence. There were days you barely spoke, nights when backs stayed turned. But beneath it all, something held. A choice not made once at the altar, but every day after, to stay, to soften, to see. So was love a luxury? Maybe. But maybe it was also a kind of miracle. Not the loud kind, the quiet one. The kind that builds in shared glances, in folded tunics, in soup stirred with a little extra care. The kind that sneaks in, unannounced, and stays, through winters, through stillbirths, through seasons of hunger and joy alike. Tonight, as you rest your head and let your breathing slow, picture a hand resting lightly on yours, calloused, familiar, unchosen, but cherished. You didn't plan this, but here it is. And maybe that's what love always was, an accident, a grace, a whisper that stayed long enough to be heard. You're no longer newlyweds. The village knows your names together now, not just separately. That's Margot's husband. That's Eli's wife. You share more than a bed. You share routines, seasons, worries. And now, you share something else. A growing belly, a quiet sickness in the morning, the shift in how others look at you. Because in the medieval world, once a woman married, the next chapter wasn't about dreams or travel or personal fulfillment. It was about children, or rather, about producing them. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now slow your breathing. Curl slightly onto your side, as if holding something close. Because tonight, we explore a truth as old as time, what it meant when pregnancy was not a possibility, but an expectation. In the Middle Ages, fertility wasn't a hope, it was a duty, especially for women. The church taught that a woman's purpose was to obey, serve, and bear children. A fruitful womb was seen as a sign of divine favor. Infertility, a curse, a judgment, perhaps even a punishment for sin. Imagine that weight, month after month, eyes watching your waistline, whispers when your time of bleeding passed, or didn't. You were expected to conceive early, and often, not just once, not twice. Dozens of pregnancies were common. Some women spent most of their adult lives either with child or recovering from loss, because not every pregnancy brought a baby. Stillbirth, miscarriage, infant death. They weren't exceptions. They were part of the rhythm. A mother might bury more children than she raised. Now imagine this. You feel the first nausea, the dizziness in the fields. Your neighbor notices before you speak. You're congratulated, but not gently, not joyfully. It's more like a passing of a burden. You'll be tired now. She'll need more broth. She's doing what women do. There's no celebration, just expectation. Your body is not a mystery. It's a vessel, a tool, a field to be sown again and again. And childbirth, it was not a sacred event in the way we think of it today. It was dangerous, terrifying. Midwives helped, women who learned through blood and screams, not textbooks. They used herbs, prayers, charms. They tied talismans to the bedpost. They whispered to Mary, because most women knew giving life could also mean giving your life. Pelvises too small, babies too large. Hemorrhages, infections, and no antibiotics. You entered labor with a candle in your hand, not just for light, but so the priest could give last rites if needed. And men? They weren't allowed in. Childbirth was a women's space, but also a woman's burden. Your husband waited outside, maybe anxious, maybe indifferent, maybe already thinking about the next season's planting. If the child lived, the next ritual came fast, baptism, usually within days, sometimes hours. Death came quickly to babies. Better to save the soul while the body still breathed. If the child died, you grieved. Quietly. The village said, God willed it. Your mother said, another will come. But in the dark of night, your arms ached, not from work, from absence, and still, you loved, despite the fear, despite the risk. Maybe you stroked your belly and sang. Maybe your husband brought you extra honey. Maybe you whispered names to the bump, even if you wouldn't dare say them aloud. Love bloomed, even when death stood nearby. And what if you couldn't conceive? The blame almost always fell on the woman. You were shamed, poked, sent to drink sacred waters or chew bitter herbs. Some women were cast out, others replaced by younger wives, and still others found peace in the barrenness, in the quiet, in the freedom to move without fear of pain, blood, loss. They became healers, midwives, whisperers. They turned absence into identity. So tonight, as you settle into your own body, think of hers, the one that bore 10 children and buried 6, the one that never conceived, but held so many others. The one that risked everything, again and again, just to fulfill a role she never asked for. And in that remembering, may you find softness for her, for yourself, for every body that carried more than it ever should have been asked to. You've been married long enough to understand your spouse's rhythms, their hands, their hunger, their hurts. You've shared winters, shared losses, shared small joys. But desire still feels dangerous, not because it hurts, but because it isn't always allowed. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now exhale slowly. Let the day slip off your shoulders. Because tonight, we pull back the curtain on a question that haunted couples for centuries. What could you actually do in your own bed without risking your soul? In medieval Europe, the answer was anything but clear. The church's rules about intimacy were not only strict, they were confusing. A mix of scripture, philosophy, folklore, and fear. Sex, even in marriage, was framed not as a celebration, but as a concession, a necessary evil to continue the human race, tolerated only within the bounds of procreation. So, What was permitted? Marital intercourse in the missionary position on a non-holy day with the intention of conceiving a child. And what was forbidden? Everything else. Some lists were exhaustive, almost obsessive. You couldn't lie with your spouse on Sundays, Fridays, religious feast days, during Lent, Advent, the eve of communion, the day before receiving confession, that left very few safe nights. Some historians estimate nearly 1/3 of the calendar year was marked as off-limits. And even when it was permitted, the list of what you couldn't do inside your marriage bed was longer than what you could. No oral stimulation, no unnatural positions, no prolonged pleasure. No climax without the goal of conception. Desire for its own sake. Sin. Touch that didn't aim toward pregnancy. Sin. Pleasure that lingered too long. Sin. Even too much passion for your own spouse could be called carnal gluttony. Imagine that. Loving your partner too much could be a confession, and people did confess, to priests who ask questions more intimate than a friend ever would. Did you touch your wife with lust? Did you think of her while at Mass? Did she speak during the act? Each sin came with a penance, a pilgrimage, a whipping, a week of fasting, or silence, or worse, shame that lingered like a second skin. For some couples, this created distance. Intimacy became fraught with anxiety. The body a battlefield between hunger and holiness. Others rebelled, quietly. They touched anyway, kissed anyway, spoke soft words in the dark, and trusted in forgiveness. But even rebellion had limits, because the church didn't only police bodies, it shaped minds. And yet, human creativity always finds a way. There were sex guides, disguised as health manuals, written by monks who had clearly imagined more than they admitted. There were fertility charms and whispered prayers to saints with suspicious specialties. One example, Saint Margaret was invoked during childbirth, but some women called her earlier, for conception. They wore relics, hid herbs in their beds, recited coded verses that blurred the line between sacred and sensual. In village kitchens, old women passed down stories, recipes for love potions, ways to heat the blood, roots that encouraged desire without risking conception. They were part midwife, part therapist, part priestess. The church scorned them, but women sought them. Because in the end, people wanted more than duty. They wanted closeness, touch, mutuality, connection. And if that meant risking a little penance, so be it. A night of real warmth could be worth the cold pew of confession the next morning. So now, in the hush of your own night, ask yourself, what would you do if you lived then? Would you follow the rules? Would you whisper into the darkness anyway? Would you reach for someone you loved, even if heaven was watching? Only your breath answers now, soft, steady, human, and still worthy of grace. You've lived many seasons together now. The children have grown, or been buried. The bread rises more slowly these days, and so do your knees when you stand. But marriage doesn't quiet with age. It deepens, and sometimes it darkens. Because in a world onde médicos eram escassos e os remédios vinham da terra, as emoções e os corpos procuravam alívio onde pudessem, em poções, promessas e feitiços. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let yourself drift. Picture a cottage lit only by fire. A woman stirring something in a pot not meant for eating. A man burying something beneath the threshold of his home. Tonight, we ask, when love faltered, who did you turn to? In medieval Europe, the line between medicine and magic was thin. There were no psychologists, no couples therapy, no books on communication. When love grew cold or cruel, You didn't talk. You acted. Sometimes in secret. Sometimes in fear. Sometimes in desperation. Let's start with women. A wife who felt neglected might visit the herbalist, or the curandera, or the old widow whose garden always bloomed a little too brightly. She might ask for something to sweeten the heart, something to make her husband return home quicker, speak softer, want her again. She'd leave with a small cloth bag filled with dried rose petals and crushed fennel, instructions to place it beneath his pillow, a warning: don't speak while tying the knot. The silence makes it strong. These were known as love charms, part prayer, part placebo, entirely hope. Men sought help too, not just for desire, but for control. A husband fearing infidelity might mix wormwood into his wife's drink, to bind her eyes, they said. Some buried nails under the doorstep, or tied animal bones with red thread near the hearth. Others carried talismans made of wax and string, shaped to resemble their wives, believing it could keep them faithful, or at least quiet. Some of it was superstition. Some worked in ways science still can't explain. But most of it came from one truth: people didn't feel powerful, so they looked for power wherever they could. Then there were fertility spells, not to prevent, but to provoke. Childlessness haunted couples like a curse, so they bathed in river water under moonlight, hid wheat under mattresses, made love while reciting verses backward, all to coax a soul into the womb. And if that failed, they blamed each other, or neighbors, or witches. Because when life hurt, when intimacy failed, someone had to carry the weight. The church condemned all of it, said spells were works of the devil, said only prayer could solve what the body couldn't. But the same priests who preached sermons by day often asked the old women for tinctures at night, because even clergy had desires, had spouses, had struggles they couldn't fix with doctrine alone. And what of love? It changed too. Couples drifted. Resentments grew. A wife might stop speaking. A husband might stop touching. They lived like shadows beside one another. But sometimes, a whisper of magic softened things. A charm tucked into a shoe. A piece of bread baked with thyme, not for flavor, but for healing. A silent wish spoken into a cup of ale. And slowly, they returned. Not always, not perfectly, but enough. So tonight, let yourself imagine the hands of someone long ago, tying a knot with trembling fingers. Not to control, not to curse, but simply to hold on, to hope, to try. And may you sleep knowing that even in a world of silence and strain, people still reached for love, even if they needed a little magic to do it. By now, you've lived through many of the hidden corners of medieval intimacy. Its silences, its rituals, its tenderness born in survival. But love, especially in a world of fragile power and harsh expectation, could twist. And when it twisted, it often became jealousy. Not the soft kind, not just suspicion, but a shadow that could stain a marriage or end it. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let your thoughts slow, like smoke curling from a dying hearth. Tonight, we enter a room where love turns hard and honor sleeps with one eye open. In the Middle Ages, honor wasn't just a virtue, it was a currency, especially for men. A husband's social standing depended not only on his land or strength, but on his wife's fidelity. If she was seen speaking to another man, too long, too warmly, whispers would spread, and those whispers could ruin a life. For women, jealousy was more complex. They didn't have legal power, but they had memory, observation, words passed to neighbors, silence withheld at the hearth. But men, they had recourse. Let's start with the laws. In many parts of Europe, A husband had the legal right to punish, even kill, his wife if caught in the act of adultery. In France, Italy, England, the rules varied, but the threat remained. A woman's infidelity wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was theft of lineage. How could a man be sure the children were his? So jealousy became a defense of blood, and the punishments were severe: stoning, shaving the head, branding, banishment. In some towns, adulterous women were made to ride backwards on donkeys, holding signs of shame. Men who cheated often paid fines or did penance, but rarely faced the same rage, because male desire was excused, female desire was feared. And yet, affairs happened. Love grew in shadows, in glances at the well, in shared laughter while binding wheat. A woman might long for someone kinder. A man might seek comfort with a neighbor's wife. Some liaisons were emotional, others physical. Some were imaginary, built in longing. Some real and deeply dangerous. Letters were rare, risky. Meetings brief, cloaked in market noise or candlelight. And always, the risk of being caught. But jealousy didn't always stem from infidelity. Sometimes, it came from poverty, from fatigue, from knowing your spouse no longer looked at you the way they once did. Maybe your wife spent too long at the river. Maybe your husband praised another woman's bread. The smallest gesture could spiral. A change in tone, a missed embrace, a silence too long at dinner. And with no tools to express insecurity, couples fought with coldness, with distance, with accusation. No counselors, no therapists. Just two people trapped in a home too small to escape each other's thoughts. Still, not all jealousy led to cruelty. Some led to change. A man might begin walking his wife to church again. A woman might start wearing her hair the way she did when they first married. Not out of submission, but out of fear, of loss. Because sometimes jealousy came from a place of love warped by power, and love, despite everything, still wanted to be chosen. So tonight, if your mind is restless, think of them, a couple long ago, sitting in silence after harsh words. One reaching slowly for the other's hand beneath the table, not to accuse, not to punish, but to forgive, to stay, to try again, even when trust had splintered, even when pride had spoken louder than the heart. Because beneath jealousy was often just fear of being left unseen. And in the stillness of a shared bed, even after the storm, there was sometimes room for mercy. There are days now when your spouse is not beside you. They've gone to the fields, to market, to war, to serve, to heal. Distance was a common guest in medieval marriage, sometimes for days, sometimes for years. And in that silence, sometimes words were born. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now lean back. Imagine a quill scratching across parchment. A hand rough with labor trying to write something it's never said aloud. Because tonight, we open the most delicate drawer of medieval intimacy, letters. And the fragile longing pressed between lines. In the Middle Ages, writing was a privilege and a rarity. Most peasants were illiterate. Letters, if written, were dictated to scribes, clerics, monks. A man might whisper his message while the scribe translated it into formal Latin. A woman might press a token, a cloth, a flower, into the fold of a message she couldn't read herself. But even among the literate, writing was intimate, reserved, sacred. Letters between spouses weren't common, which made them powerful. Some still survive. A 15th century soldier writes to his wife, "My own sweetheart, I commend myself unto you. No creature living shall be loved by me as ye be." A woman left behind during her husband's travels pens. "I send you these words to say only this. The house is quiet without you. The stew tastes different. I hear your laugh in the wind. These fragments reveal not just love, but yearning, a hunger more painful than absence itself. And often, the letters weren't returned. Mail could be intercepted, lost, burned. So sometimes, a wife wrote a letter, knowing no reply would come. And still, she wrote. Because writing was remembering, and remembering was resisting erasure. But it wasn't always tender. Some letters expressed anger. You left me with no coin and no word. The children are ill. You promised more. Others, frustration. Your mother came again. She questions my bread. I question your silence. In their ink, women voiced what they could not speak in public. Men too confessed what they couldn't face aloud. I dream of you in the chapel's silence. Your scarf still smells of mint. I have not touched another. I swear. Letters also became confessions of desire. The courtly love tradition, romanticized in poetry and song, seeped into real life. Men wrote to women they couldn't marry. Women replied under pseudonyms. Some used codes. Some used metaphors too rich to be innocent. Your name is a weight in my chest. I feel it when I need bread, when I wake, when I lie beside a man who is not you. These words danced on dangerous ground. If discovered, they could ruin a woman's life, or worse. But still, they were written. Because the heart, even in a time of plagues and priests, needed to speak. And not all letters were romantic. Some were simply updates. The chickens have started laying again. I mended your cloak. It's folded on your bed. The river rose last night. I thought of the day you carried me across it. These were not declarations of love, but they were acts of it. In each word lived memory, presence, longing, and hope. So tonight, close your eyes. Imagine your name written in another's hand. A crooked script, a smudge from a tear, a scent of wax or rosemary. Someone wrote this for you. Because absence couldn't erase feeling. Because paper, in its silence, became the safest place for love to breathe. By now, you've lived through joy and ache, through quiet nights and cold mornings, through childbirth, through jealousy, through hunger and laughter, and letters sent into silence. But what if you wanted to leave? What if love grew bitter? What if hands turned cruel? What if silence no longer protected, but punished? In the Middle Ages, the answer was often simple and devastating. You couldn't. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now breathe slowly. Feel the walls of a house too small to escape. Because tonight, we explore a painful truth. When the heart needed distance, but the law said stay. Divorce, as we know it today, did not exist. In Catholic Europe, marriage was a sacrament, a holy binding contract blessed by God and sealed by consummation. Once you had lain together as man and wife, your souls were considered fused. The bond could not be broken, not by boredom, not by violence, not by grief. Only death would free you. And yet, people tried. There were rare cases of annulment where the church declared a marriage invalid, as if it had never existed. Valid reasons included consanguinity, you were secretly cousins, a common occurrence, lack of consummation, forced marriage without consent, proof of pre-existing vows, one was already betrothed or secretly a cleric. But these were legal mazes, expensive, public, humiliating, and mostly accessible only to the wealthy. The average woman who suffered beatings, or the man whose wife abandoned the hearth, had no easy remedy. They stayed, or they escaped, not legally, but physically. Some women fled to convents. Seeking spiritual refuge, they sometimes gained protection under the church, but entry wasn't guaranteed, and families often came to retrieve them. Others simply disappeared, changed towns, hid under new names, took up service far from home. Men had more freedom. They might abandon a wife, move to another village, and begin again, sometimes with another woman, sometimes with no word sent back. And yet, abandonment was a sin. Clergy condemned it. Villages gossiped. Children bore the weight. Some spouses negotiated informal separations, living apart, dividing property, agreeing never to see each other again. It wasn't legal, but it was survivable. Still, the social cost was immense. You were judged, feared, pitied, forgotten. And in many homes, separation wasn't even attempted. People endured. They built lives inside marriages that no longer offered warmth. They tended gardens, raised children, slept back to back for decades. Was there love? Sometimes. Was there kindness? Often. But sometimes there was only silence and survival. And yet, resistance found quiet forms. A woman might bake for herself first. A man might sleep in the barn by choice. A couple might avoid eye contact for years, but still share the same bread, the same roof, the same grave. Some found new love outside their marriage, discreet, fleeting, forbidden. A blacksmith's apprentice who glanced too long. A widow who sold you eggs with a hand that lingered. These moments never became life partnerships, but they became memories, warmth, proof that your heart hadn't gone completely cold. And in some rare stories, reconciliation bloomed. An illness softened the edge of resentment. A shared grief bridged the distance. A grandchild was born, a new roof built, and one day, after years of distance, a hand was offered again. Shaky, uncertain, but offered. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, ask yourself gently, what does it mean to stay? What does it mean to leave? And what, in a world without doors, counted as escape? Because in the Middle Ages, sometimes the bravest thing you could do was remain and still try to find grace inside the walls that never opened. You've learned to sleep beside them, to speak through glances, to live inside the same silence. But when you step back, you start to see something. You don't hold the same space in this marriage. Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't only shaped by custom, it was shaped by hierarchy, and most of the time, that meant power was uneven. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and what time is it? It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, stretch gently. Let your thoughts slow like the bending of a tired back at dusk. Because tonight, we open the question most medieval lovers never dared ask aloud. Can you really love someone who holds power over you? In the eyes of the church and the law, the husband was head of the household, literally and symbolically. A wife owed him obedience, chastity, labor, and service. A husband owed her protection, shelter, and conjugal rights, but only when convenient or permitted. This wasn't simply cultural, it was written in sermons, in legal codes, in household manuals. Let the woman be silent in the home. Let her submit as the church submits to Christ. These weren't metaphorical, they were instructions. Even in daily life, the imbalance showed. A woman couldn't own property without her husband's approval, unless she was a widow. She couldn't testify against him in court. She couldn't travel freely. She could be punished physically for disobedience, within limits, but rarely enforced. Even her clothes signaled submission, covered hair, modest shape, no bright colors unless approved. A married woman wore her obedience like a second skin, and yet she loved. She found ways to express it, but she did so within the boundaries or around them. Some couples lived gently. A man might lead in name, but listen in practice. A woman might knead dough while quietly guiding every decision made under their roof. There's a phrase that echoes through medieval letters. He rules the land, but she rules the house. And sometimes that was true, but not always. Some marriages were cruel. The man drank, hit, took what he wanted, and left her to count bruises like rosary beads, and she couldn't leave. So she coped, or resisted, in quiet ways. A thread loosened in his tunic, a cold spoon at dinner, a door locked just long enough to remind him she had hands too. And what about emotional power? It didn't belong solely to men. A wife could withhold affection, could wound with words, could remind him of his failures in front of others, and that stung in a world built on pride. She could turn their shared bed into a place of punishment, not comfort, and she could grieve and withdraw and make the silence between them ring louder than any shout. Power wasn't always physical. Sometimes it lived in the ability to walk away from a gaze without flinching. But in rare homes, something else happened. They met as equals, not in law, but in heart. They shared work, shared decisions, raised children as a team, prayed beside each other, and held hands when no one watched. Not because they had to, because they chose to. They were rare, but they existed. And their legacy lives not in statues or stories, but in a pair of wooden shoes worn down at the same rate. A hearth where two spoons rested side by side. So tonight, rest your head knowing this. Love didn't always come from equality. But when it did, even just a little, it glowed like a candle in a stone cell. Small, flickering, but fiercely alive. You've lived a long time together now. The urgency of youth has softened. The children, if they survived, now have children of their own. The fields feel heavier. The stairs seem longer. But in the quiet of late evenings, when the fire has burned low and your hands tremble for reasons you no longer name, you still turn toward each other and wonder, is there space for desire when the body has changed? Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Tonight, let yourself slow. Let your joints rest, your breath deepen. Because we are entering a different intimacy, the one that arrives not in bloom, but in stillness. In the Middle Ages, few people lived past 40. If you did, you were called old by 35. Not because your heart slowed, but because your body had borne so much. To age in a medieval marriage was to carry proof on your hands, your hips, your teeth, your silence. A woman who had birthed 10 children often lost teeth early, her skin thinned, her back curved from years at the basin. A man who had worked the plough for decades walked with one shoulder higher than the other, his hands like bark. Desire did not vanish, but it changed shape. So what happened to love when the skin no longer shimmered with youth? For many couples, it became something quieter. Touch didn't always lead to pleasure. It led to comfort. A hand on the lower back, helping to rise. A foot against a calf, checking warmth. A shared blanket, adjusted without request. Evenings once filled with motion became rituals of care. Heating a cloth for aching joints, cutting bread into smaller pieces, holding a bowl as the other drank. These gestures weren't grand, but they were deeply intimate. Some couples stopped sleeping together, not from distance, but from practicality. He snored. She coughed. Their bodies, once a source of heat, now needed space to breathe. And so, a second bed was prepared, a second room, if they could afford it. And yet, in the quietest moments, one would return to the other. Not for passion, for presence, to hear the rhythm of breath they'd come to know better than their own. But desire, it didn't die. Sometimes it returned unexpectedly, like birds in early spring, a dream, a memory, the touch of warm hands while helping with a shoe. It wasn't about youth or perfection. It was about being seen, still. After all these years, after all those winters, after all the silence and soil and sorrow, still being desired, not for what the body could do, but for what it had endured. And sometimes older couples laughed again, not youthfully, but freely, because time had stripped away expectation. They no longer needed to impress, only to share, to rest, to witness each other. And when illness came, as it always did, love changed once more. It knelt beside the bed, lifted the cup, changed the linen, held the hand, and at the end, it stayed. Not because of vows, because of time. Time lived together. Time survived together. Time made sacred by repetition. So tonight, as your own body settles, with its aches, its lines, its softness, remember them, the couples who aged in silence. In fields, in stone houses, in worn shoes, they loved, not in fire, but in coals that glowed long after the flames had faded. And that, perhaps, was the deepest warmth of all. Not every marriage carried passion, and even the ones that did, lost it sometimes. The body grew tired, the heart grew cautious. The silence between gestures stretched a little too long. But in the Middle Ages, when intimacy faded, you didn't call a therapist. You called a herbalist. Velho conhecido. Ou, se fosse preciso, alguém que atendia só à noite. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now close your eyes. Picture a small cloth bag, tied with twine, the scent of dried herbs, the flicker of a single candle. Tonight, we open the old book of love's secret recipes, the ones whispered, not written. Let's begin with aphrodisiacs, though the word didn't exist yet. In village kitchens, cupboards held more than grain, they held possibilities. Fennel, believed to spark warmth in the belly and openness in the heart. Honey mixed with thyme, stirred into wine to sweeten the blood. Nettle root, boiled and strained, for virility. Cinnamon and cloves, added to stews for more than flavor. And the most potent of all, mandrake, a root shaped like a tiny human body, said to scream when pulled from the ground. Dangerous, sacred, kept in secret. Couples seeking to reignite affection might place a mandrake beneath the bed, wrapped in silk, sprinkled with rose water, prayed over by candlelight. It wasn't about science. It was about hope. Then came the rituals. A woman might tie knots in thread as she thought of her husband. One for memory, one for desire, one for safety. She'd keep the thread in her bodice, close to her heart. A man might carve symbols into a piece of bread, bless it in silence, and feed it to his wife. And together, they might walk to a sacred spring, dip their hands, and speak no words all the way home. These weren't spells, they were gestures, sacred because they were shared, and for some, help came from prayers. There were saints who understood the body. Saint Valentine, before he became a symbol of cards and roses, he was invoked by lovers seeking unity. Saint Agnes, protector of chastity, but also the one whispered to when desire needed direction. Saint Anthony, finder of lost things, including affection. A woman might light a candle before a small image. A man might carry a saint's token in his pocket on long journeys, not for protection from danger, but for remembrance of warmth. But when love struggled, it wasn't always about desire. Sometimes it was grief, exhaustion, mistrust. And there were remedies for that too. Bathing together in rosemary-infused water, swapping tokens, a lock of hair, a cloth worn near the skin, sleeping one night apart, then sharing the same bed again, as a kind of reset, burning bitter herbs to clear old anger from the room. Simple, symbolic, silent. But for couples who couldn't find the right words, these gestures spoke for them. And in some places, women helped each other. A wife struggling with her husband's distance might speak to an older neighbor who offered more than advice. She might offer a charm, a listening ear, or just a hand placed gently on hers, saying, "Try this." I did. Not every remedy worked, but they offered possibility. And sometimes the act of trying, of making tea with crushed petals, of braiding a token into the pillowcase, reminded you why you wanted love in the first place. It wasn't about fixing. It was about remembering. So tonight, let yourself imagine someone stirring a pot not for hunger, but for hope. Someone laying down beside their spouse after weeks of silence and whispering, "Drink this." Not as a cure, but as a promise. That love could still be warmed, still be called back from wherever it had wandered, still be worth one more small, sacred effort. The world you lived in didn't make space for reckless love. It made space for duty, for lineage, for inheritance. But sometimes, quietly, people said no. No to the arrangement. No to the safe choice. No to a life lived in quiet obedience. And in saying no, they carved their names into the cracks of history. Most were erased, but a few remained. You never met them, not really, but you know them, because every time someone chose love over fear, even for a moment, they joined a silent lineage. And tonight, you walk with them. They lived in castles and cottages, in the shadows of abbeys and the corners of markets. Some wore silk, others wore dirt under their fingernails. But all of them loved the wrong way, according to the rules of their time. And because of that, we remember them. There was the scholar and the student. He was a philosopher. She was the niece of a canon. She was too young, he too famous. They met in the candlelit hush of Latin lessons. He taught, she listened, and something burned between them. Quiet, slow, consuming. When their love was discovered, it did not end in exile. It ended in blood. He was attacked, mutilated. She was sent to a convent. They never touched again. But their letters, those long, aching pages written in ink and memory, survived. In them, they speak of the body, the soul, the silence between them. They do not regret the love, only the cruelty of a world that feared it. There was the queen who ruled with a voice sharper than any sword, and the king who tried to silence her. She had children, countries, lovers, perhaps. But more than that, she had a will. She was imprisoned. She waited, and when she was finally released, she returned not to vengeance, but to governance. She outlived him. She outlived nearly everyone. Love didn't soften her, but it marked her. There was the prince who fell in love with his wife's lady-in-waiting. They hid, whispered, built a life beneath the gaze of courts and priests. She gave him children. And when she was taken, not by illness but by the executioner's blade, he went mad with grief. They say he crowned her corpse, placed her bones on a throne, forced the court to kiss her hand. Love, they said, had turned to madness. But perhaps it had always been a little mad, that kind of love in that kind of world. And beyond these names, there were others, unwritten, unrecorded, a baker and a widow, a knight and a shepherd's son. A wife who fled a cruel home to live in secret with the one she chose. Most were punished, some disappeared, but for a brief moment, they tasted something most never dared to reach for. Not just love, but chosen love. Love that asked nothing of lineage. Love that didn't fit into parchment or law. Love that didn't beg for permission. And even when their stories ended in silence, that silence echoed. Because somewhere, someone remembered the girl who ran, the man who wept, the letter never sent, the kiss left hidden in a chapel alcove. You don't need to know their names, only that they lived, only that, in a time when marriage was duty, they loved with a kind of defiance that still warms the edges of history. So tonight, as you lie still beneath your own quiet ceiling. Imagine them, not as martyrs, but as people who loved with both hands, even when one hand was shaking, even when it cost them everything. They didn't change the world, but for a moment they changed each other. And sometimes that's enough. There is a hush that falls over the house when prayers are done and the fire sighs low. A hush not of silence, but of reverence. In this hush, you reach for them, not just with hands, but with something slower, something shaped by years of kneeling and wondering and waiting. Because in the Middle Ages, the space between two lovers was never empty. It was filled with God, not as punishment, not as judge, but as presence. And that presence changed everything. You didn't belong only to each other. You belonged to the church. Your wedding wasn't just a vow between hearts. It was a binding of souls, witnessed by saints, sanctified by ritual. And every moment of intimacy afterward echoed with that weight. Before you touched, you crossed yourself. After you lay together, you whispered confessions, not because love was forbidden, but because desire was dangerous. The body, they said, was weak, the flesh fallen. Even in marriage, pleasure had to be careful, measured, purposeful, never indulgent. You weren't just husband and wife, you were two souls trying not to fall. Some couples feared even their own closeness. They slept apart on holy days. They fasted from each other during Advent. They withheld touch during Lent, not just food. They believed abstaining brought them nearer to heaven, that denying the body purified the spirit. And yet, others found their faith through love, not in spite of it. They believed God lived not just in the altar or the scripture, but in the steady rhythm of shared breath, the softness of touch after grief, the wordless prayer of holding someone too tightly and too long. Their marriage bed became not just a place of rest, but of quiet sanctity, where forgiveness began, where hope returned, where faith took the shape of a kiss. There were no books to tell them how to love faithfully and physically, but they wrote their own theology in gestures, a hand held during storms, a head bowed not in fear, but in gratitude, a glance upward, as if asking silently, "Is this holy enough?" And often, the answer came not from the heavens, but from the peace that followed. They prayed together, not always in church, sometimes over bread, sometimes over wounds, sometimes over each other. Faith did not separate them, it deepened them. It gave them language when desire felt wordless. It gave them space when the world gave them none. And when illness came, or war, or loss, they clung to both, to the cross and to each other. Because when the body weakened, the soul did not always rise, but a hand, familiar, worn, constant, could keep them tethered to life. So as your breath evens and the room darkens, remember this: medieval love was not godless. It was not reckless. It was reverent, rooted in a belief that the soul and the skin were not enemies, that they could meet quietly under a blanket, and that sometimes a whispered "stay with me" was the holiest prayer of all. Love, in the Middle Ages, wore different clothes depending on where you stood. Sometimes it smelled like manure. Sometimes it shimmered in silk. But whether you lived beneath thatch or beneath tapestry, one truth remained. To love someone was to risk something, and how you loved was shaped by the walls around you. In the village, love was often small, not in depth, but in space. You grew up with the person you'd marry. You knew their voice before you knew desire. There were no letters, no songs, just shared tools and shared silences. And that was enough. You didn't kiss in public. You didn't whisper dreams. You lived beside each other the way rivers live beside fields, winding, unspoken, always present. You married for work, for survival, to combine animals, land, labor. But love still came. In glances over stew pots, in shoulders brushed in the barn, in the way someone waited just a moment longer at the door. You fought over broken carts, over who ate the last bread, over nothing, and you forgave, not with apologies, with shared firewood, with a mended sock, with a return to rhythm. In the court, love was louder and more dangerous. There were rules for how to speak, how to sit, how to flirt without seeming to flirt. You married for politics, for land, for lineage. Your wedding wasn't yours. It belonged to your house. But behind curtains and under veils, love still dared. It passed as poetry, as dance, as letters folded into sleeves. It was performed, and sometimes punished. A noblewoman who looked too long, a knight who served two hearts. Love in the court was spectacle, but rarely sanctuary. Affairs bloomed in whispers. Chambermaids knew more secrets than scribes. Pages carried more than just messages. And yet, it was fragile. One wrong word, and love became exile. One wrong night, and it became death. Back in the village, no one wrote verses, but someone saved the last piece of cheese, hung herbs over the bed, sat closer than needed. There were no silk sheets, only rough wool, and the kind of warmth that builds from knowing someone's breath in the dark. The difference between the court and the field wasn't feeling, it was freedom. In the village, there was no room to dream, but also fewer walls to hide behind. In the court, everything was masked, polished, dangerous. One gave you silence, the other, spectacle. Neither guaranteed happiness. Both carried risk, and some people crossed between them. A lady's maid who loved a footman, a travelling musician who made a noblewoman weep, a blacksmith's daughter who caught a knight's eye. Those stories rarely ended well, but they burned brightly, briefly, and sometimes the songs lived longer than the lovers. So now, as the room around you fades to stillness, ask yourself, would you have chosen the simplicity of shared bread in the field, or the thrill of forbidden glances behind velvet curtains? Both had longing, both had loss, and in the quiet, both offered the same hope. To be seen, to be held, to be remembered, even for one night, as more than a contract, as a heartbeat. It was never about romance, not really. It was about surviving together, and sometimes, in the quiet corners of that survival, finding reasons to smile. They didn't write love stories. They lived them, not in pages, but in the rhythm of shared days, in the details no one ever thought to write down. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely gentle. There were injuries, illness, children lost, futures shifted by weather, war, or a lord's whim. And yet, there were also mornings when the bread rose just right, when the goats didn't stray. When someone said something soft, unexpected, that made the other laugh, a rare laugh, a real one. They didn't have the words we do now. Emotional labor, communication, trauma. But they knew what it meant to be tired and still wash someone's feet, to be angry and still slice their bread just a little thicker, to be disappointed and still light the fire before they woke. Arguments weren't about deep truths. They were about the wrong herbs in the stew, the neighbour's sheep again, the tools left in the rain. There were doors slammed, if there were doors at all. But reconciliation didn't need apology. Only a blanket draped, a silence softened, a space made warm again. And when they laughed, it wasn't always at jokes. Sometimes it was at absurdity. The baby that peed on both of them, the time she chased a goose into the churchyard, the way his hair stood up in the cold. It wasn't romance, it was companionship. And sometimes that was sweeter. They cried too, at funerals, at births. In the stillness after the midwife left the room too soon. And sometimes they cried in private, one sitting on the edge of the bed, the other pretending to sleep. But they stayed, because staying was its own kind of love. Some days passed without a word, others with too many. They didn't go on trips to reconnect. They had fields, firewood, a leaking roof. But maybe, over time, their hands found each other under the table. Maybe the silence became less sharp. Maybe the scent of stew meant home, not labor. And when age came, slow, steady, undeniable, love didn't leave. It just changed shape. It limped. It repeated itself. It listened more than it spoke. It meant helping the other up from bed. It meant finishing sentences. It meant knowing when to leave them be and when not to. They weren't saints, but they were loyal in ways we rarely see, not to perfection, to presence. So as you lie still, feeling the weight of your own day, remember them. The couples who didn't always say "I love you," but said, "Did you eat yet? Don't forget your cloak. I kept the warmer side of the bed for you." And in those sentences, they said everything.